Hi, this is Greg Hughes from 90-Second Website Builder. As you probably know, there's a lot of tools built into the interface of the software that allow you to build just about any kind of website you can imagine. I'm going to focus on one specific tool today that's a very commonly used tool, and it's a very powerful tool for laying out a website. This video, we're going to build an entire web page, and we're going to do it using the tool called the Layout Grid. Now, the advantage of a layout grid is it allows you to make responsive or mobile-friendly websites very quickly without the use of breakpoints and page variations. If you've seen my other videos on how to build responsive websites using breakpoints and page variations, you'll know that that's a very powerful way to do it, but it actually is harder. While it gives you more control over the layout of your page, the use of breakpoints is more laborious. It takes more time. And so I'm going to show you a faster way to make responsive websites, basically, with the layout grid. I also have videos about how the layout grid works specifically. So in this video, we're just going to build an entire web page using layout grids. That's the tool called the layout grid, of course, over here in the layout category of the toolbox. And to use a layout grid, we simply click on one and drag it out onto the page. Of course, layout grids always snap to the next position of the page. That's by design. We want that to happen. We aren't using what's called fixed or absolute positioning as you would with other kinds of web design methods in 90-Second Website Builder. The idea of a layout grid is that it's going to take care of our responsiveness for us, so to speak. And that's why it needs to snap into place. If we were to grab another layout grid, it would snap into place under that one. That will make more sense as you design using layout grids. You'll appreciate why it's doing that. If you're used to doing more of a fixed position design with this software, this can be different for you. Normally, just grabbing something and putting it on the page wherever you want to put it, and it stays where you drag and drop it. But we're doing something different now. We're doing something that allows us to make the page fluid or responsive. And so the layout grid is going to snap into position. That's very important. Also, whenever we put one on the page, by default, it shows us a layout grid with 2 cells, sometimes called columns. But you don't have to have 2. You can have as many as 12 and as few as 1. And this is where you set those. You can also determine their relationship to each other and their size ratio. In this case, I'm actually just going to use a 1-column grid. So I'm going to remove one of these, and we'll just have 1 column or 1 cell in this layout grid. The other thing we're going to be doing as we work with layout grids, and this is another really important tip if you're learning to work with layout grids, this is a very important thing to know. We're going to talk a lot about padding, because padding is that space around the edge of your grid or the edge of your objects that allow you to place those on the page in a sensible way, in a way that looks good. We'll be using padding a lot. If you don't learn to use padding, the problem will be that you will have less control over where your objects fall into place on the page or into the grid. It'll make more sense as we go. In this case, I now just have a default layout grid with no padding and just 1 single cell. What I'd like to do is add a background image, because this is going to be my header, and I have an idea for a really big picture I want to have at the top of my website, which is pretty popular to do these days. So I'm going to the Style tab and going to Background. Instead of using transparent or a solid color, I'm going to use an image. So now I'm going to go find that image on my computer and click OK. Now, the reason you don't see the image yet, you only see the top part of it, is because the layout grid by default is only a certain height. It's not going to stretch in height until we actually put content into it. And when we do, we'll see the background image take place. This is a really big picture. The other thing we can do is we're going to be adding padding to this grid. We just talked about padding. So let's do that now. I'm going to start off with quite a lot of padding in this grid. It starts with 0, but I'm going to change this to a big number. I'm going to put a padding of 100 pixels both for the top and the bottom. Watch what happens to my grid. It's a lot bigger. Now, it's still not as big as I want it to be, because this picture is really big. But as we put content in here, it'll start to look better. The first piece of content I want to put in here is some text, but I'm not going to use the text tool. I'm going to do a different trick. I'm actually going to use something in the ready-to-use JavaScripts. Drag a box down here. I'll work with it down here, and then I'll put it in the grid. There's something called a typewriter deluxe. This allows me to create a really cool text effect and put it on my page. So to save some time, I've already made one. So let me cancel out of this, and I'll go get it. Okay, as you can see, here's a piece of text. This is actually that typewriter deluxe JavaScript. I'll double click on it so you can see how I set it up. Let me put in whatever text I want. And I put all this text separated by these little carets here. And here I get to choose the size of the font, which font I want to use, the color of it, how I want it to align. It's just a really fun way to put text on the screen. So I have some idea of what I want this to look like. So now I'm going to take this and drag it into my grid. Watch what happens. You'll notice that the grid got a little bit bigger because we have this 100 pixel padding both top and bottom, so starting to stretch. Plus this has its own size to deal with. So now my grid got a little bit taller because of this content that was put into it. So just for fun, let's do an F5. That is, let's preview what we have so far so we can see what's happening. So I click F5 and I opened up in a browser. You can see my effect here. Let me refresh the page so you can see what's happening. There's my JavaScript effect where my text is being typed into place. And I wrote 3 different pieces of text, and so all 3 of those will be filling this. But I still haven't achieved my effect. I have a pretty big picture here, and I want the whole thing to show, not just this section. I also would have to put a lot of content in here or have a lot of padding in here to make this picture show. So let's move on and see what we can do to make that look better. There is one other object I want to put in here, and that is a call to action button. So let me go get one of those. That's actually the button tool. I'm going to be using the button tool under the jQuery user interface bootstrap tools. There's a button here. It's actually called the themable button, and that's what I'm going to be using. So we just click on this and drag it onto the screen. Again, I've already made one, so let me go get it. This is a themable button, and if I double click on it, you can see how I've styled it. I pick the color. I just want a solid color and the border to be the same color. Nothing too fancy. And then I've got some text in here that just says, let's get started. We would deal with linking it to a page later on. For now, we just want it as a placeholder. So we're going to put it into our header and it snaps into place. Now, it's not exactly in the place I want it. I really wanted it to be in the center of this header. So I need to fix that. I would do that inside the grid itself. Inside the grid, I can decide to center my content. I'd do that here. And there we go. Simple enough. A little bit more of my image is showing too, but I don't have any other content that I want to put in this particular grid. And yet I have a huge picture I want to show. So one of the tricks that I can do is I can either add some empty space here or make my padding bigger, but a faster way to do it is this trick. I'm going to double click on the layout grid. And instead of, making the padding be 500 or whatever, I can do this. I can talk about the column height. Since I'm only using one column or cell, right now it's auto. That means it's going to automatically stretch to whatever's in here, plus the padding. But here's another trick. I actually want to show my entire image because the image that I have needs to be shown in its entirety. So this means I want to show 100% of my image, both vertically and horizontally in this grid. I could do 50%, but in this case, I want to show all of it. So that's just a shortcut. Again, there's other ways to do this. I could create more padding, but this is faster. I'm going to click OK. Now, you won't see it until we click F5, so we're going to preview by clicking F5. And now I want you to see what my page looks like. Aha. Now I have my header with 100 pixels of space right here. And this is such a big picture, it's actually outside of the camera, so let me go like this. If you can see my full screen, there's actually an entire image here. And I'll have to move my camera here so you can see it all because it's just too big. There we go. So as I'm moving the camera, you can see I'm trying to get this giant picture in place. Now, what happens is when I reduce the size of my browser, the image doesn't really behave the way I want it to. It's staying still. And I want this image to actually just fill the size of the browser. I don't want my user to have to stretch the browser out to actually see the image. I need to fix that too. So let's try another trick. So the way we fix that is we need to deal with the way the image covers the grid, the way it sits in the background. So let's go back to where we grabbed our image. Under the Style tab of the Layout grid, we chose an image, but we didn't size it. And we have some options here. The size I want to use in this case is called Cover, which means I want to cover the entire grid with this page at 100%. There are some other options you can play with. We won't go into those. This is the effect I actually want to achieve, and you'll see why in a second. Let's click OK. You're probably starting to see it take shape already. If we click F5, bring it into the camera here so you can see it, and now you can see that when I reduce the size of my browser, the image scales down. And that's what I'm looking for. I wanted that effect. there's other effects. Like I said, I could use contain, or I could use one of the other ones, or parallax, but I want it to be like this. So the end user pretty much sees the whole image in my header. Okay, so let's close that. All right, I think I've got the header the way I want. Now I'm going to add another grid right below this. This will be a little simpler. So I'm going to get the layout grid tool and draw a grid. And again, it snaps into place. I also want just one cell, so we'll remove this one. This one's going to be a lot simpler. For this, I'm just going to mostly have text. So I would grab the text object and drag it in here. I've already made one, so I'm going to put it in here like this. And you'll see that as I drag it into the cell or into the layout grid, it finds its place. Now, this is where padding is really important. Remember what I said about the space around my objects. I don't like the way this text box is so close to the edge of my header. That's where padding really helps me. So we've got a couple of different options. We have padding for the object itself. If we were to right click on this object and go to padding, we could put some padding on the top of it. That's one way to do it. And another one is to actually use padding for the grid itself. So I can double click on the grid and I can put some padding here. And that's the option I'm going to choose. In fact, I'm going to do about 50 pixels of padding, not only on the top, but I think on the bottom too. And that will spread things out a little better. You'll immediately see the change. And now it's starting to already look better. I needed some space here just for design purposes. I needed some space around this. And just for fun, let's put another call to action button here. I just made one with a themable button. I'm going to drag it in. And remember, I'm putting it in here. And so as it enters the grid, it highlights. And there it goes. I haven't centered it yet, but I can do that. So you may be wondering, so then why is my text centered if this isn't centered? So I haven't centered this because the layout grid doesn't have a centered quality in it. The reason the text is centered is because the text has its own setting. So this text is actually set to be centered. If we go up and look at it in the menu here, you can see this is center justification. So I did that when I did the text. So the point is there's multiple ways to do the same thing. The text itself is centered. The layout grid is not. So let's do that so that all of the contents of the grid gets centered. So horizontal, center, click OK, and there we go. And again, this object is about 50 pixels away from the edge. So all I've done at this point is I've used two layout grids, very simple ones, single column or single celled. I put in a nice background, added a cool effect with the JavaScript, a couple of buttons, and some text. And I'm already on my way to a really good looking web page. So let's click F5 and see what we have. All right, a pretty nice modern looking website. If we scroll down the page, you can see that we have our second grid and everything's spread out pretty well. We can reduce the size of this, and as you can see, it does respond. Notice that the text and the, let me move the camera down here so you can see that the text down here and this themable button are responding. I didn't have to make any page variations or breakpoints. It's automatically responding because the contents is in this layout grid. All right, so I think I've got the first section of my page built the way I want to do it. So we're going to stop the video here and pick up in video number 2, build out the rest of our page.